Now, President Bola Tinubu, since the assumption of office, has been speaking or making moves with regards to wide range policies, infidelity to the pledge he made to Nigerians, saying he will put them first at the center of government policies and address business unfriendly fiscal and monetary policies, especially multiplicity of taxes, among others. So much has been accomplished within the short time in office by the president. But let's look at the challenges because economic moves definitely have ripple effects. And to talk about this is an economist and strategist, the former chief economist with PricewaterhouseCoopers, Dr. Andrew Nevin. He joins us from London. Thank you so much, Dr. Nevin. It's good to see you today.
Oh, totally, my brother. It's always great to be with you.
Yes, I'm sure you're following the trends because, of course, you keep a tab on all that is happening here. But I want to ask you.
Of course I do.
Yeah. I want to ask you first what is your reaction to the moves made so far? First, it was a bold step of subsidy removal and unification of the foreign exchange market. As we move on, we've started seeing the effect of all of this. Inflation is biting hard, and all other moves by the monetary and fiscal side to address issues. Give an overview of what you see, what we used to have, and where we are at the moment.
Well, for years, of course, when I was at PwC and myself were advocates of a unified exchange rate. We were advocates of removal of the foil subsidy. So that was a good first start. But there's a lot more on the agenda on there. It's still early days. But a positive development is the appointment of my brother Taiwo from PwC, of course, is chairman of the Fiscal Policy Committee for His Excellency the President. And Taiwo has been very clear for the nation and taught me that I think 95 or 97% of tax revenue is from 6 or 7 different taxes. So all the rest of them can be eliminated. And he's also been very clear FIRS should be collecting taxes, not the agencies, because you go back to what you said about ease of doing business in the country, but an agency thinks of itself as a revenue collector trying to maximize its revenue. And it's not actually doing the right job to develop the industry. So move that function over to the FIRS. So I think those are positive developments. I think what you were reporting on earlier today with the Honorable Minister of Mining, of Solid Minerals, going after illegal mining, I think that's a good step. So lots of positives, but there's still some things to be done. To begin with, I think there's a real danger with this that we repeat problems of the past in the sense of creating programs. In my time, 15 years in Nigeria, one of the biggest issues is just there's programs that are created, they don't deliver value. So whether it's the mass metering program, anchor borrowers program, and of course there's capital that's been wasted, like the new terminal built in Lagos, the international terminal for $100 million. The Kaduna-Abuja Railway, I think was $600 or $700 million, not delivering value. Of course, we have the funds going to the refineries and to Ajaokuta Steel, among others. So what I'm concerned about is that if we come back to this system where every time we see a problem, we create a program, rather than thinking through why is it that the programs that we've had in the past in the country have not worked out. So I think there's a lot of work to do. Also, the ease of doing business. I've heard this rhetoric for years, and of course we have PEBEC, and PEBEC had a fantastic leader in Dr. Jamoke. But it just didn't get very far because a lot of the people mouthing words about ease of doing business don't really understand what it's like to be in business, and still given the fiscal constraints, still view the companies as a source of revenue and not an engine for growth for Nigeria. So I think lots of positives and lots of challenges going forward.
Take all these policies, we pick it one after the other. And one major thing is this FX issue. And the Minister of Economy and, of course, Finance, Coordinating Economy, Mr. Wale Edun, said Nigerians are more than enough to solve the forex issue when government is ready. It looked at diaspora remittances. It looked at savings in domiciliary accounts and saying that if we are sincere to each other, we can address this shortfall. How does this come to you with regards to our FX market?
Well, to begin with, there's a real confusion in Nigeria, and I've spoken about this maybe the last 6 or 9 months, which is people have grown up in a world where they think that the central bank's role is to supply FX, which is not really, in my view, the central bank's role. It's led to all sorts of problems. Every industry, you read in the newspaper this morning, I read the aviation industry has grounded planes both abroad and in Nigeria, and they want FX. If people want FX from the CBN. The primary cause of our FX crisis in Nigeria right now is very simple. It's the collapse in hydrocarbon production. So if hydrocarbons are one of the major suppliers of FX for the country, along with remittances, those are the two big supplies. To allow the reduction in hydrocarbons, it was 2 million barrels a day when I arrived. It was 1.7 for a lot of the years I was in Nigeria. It dropped as low as 1.0, and essentially you're not going to have any FX, and that's all that's happened on that. So I appreciate the honorable minister for coordinating the economy. I mean, I think he's a fantastic choice, but I think to come out and say we're going to look at domiciliary accounts makes people nervous that, is Nigeria going to actually do something that makes it more difficult for someone to take care of their own money? The quickest solution to me, as I said, is just get hydrocarbon production back up. So it went up to 1.3 million barrels a day in June, fell back to 1.0 million barrels a day in July, which was at least reported, which is terrible. We'll see what the August number is, but it's really urgent we get that number up. And if we get that number up, and of course oil prices are high, and we're having difficulty because the production is low, if we get the oil production up, it'll give us the breathing space to do all the other economic things on that. So I think that the idea that he's floated the domiciliary accounts is something that I'm not sure is the right. He should be 100% focused on getting hydrocarbon production back up to 1.5, 1.7, 2 million barrels a day.
Well, that's a big one, a real big one. But we also need policies at this time to attract foreign investment. The president is up to India later today. We've seen moves like that in France immediately got into office and all of this. So I'd like to ask you, what more can we do to deepen trade, to improve investment at this very critical time?
Sorry, let me start out by saying I'm very pleased that India is hosting the G20, and I'm very pleased that Nigeria is a special guest of India. We wrote a paper when I was at PwC on the importance of the economic relationship and political relationship between India and Nigeria. We talked, my wife and I, my wife is of Indian origin. We were at the India High Commissioner's house many times discussing this prior to our departure from Nigeria. So it's really heartening to see Mr. Elamelu kind of leading the charge for the private sector involvement. So I think that's a fantastic development. But when you say policies for business environment, I don't think the problem is policies. I think the problem is people are wary that they're going to invest in Nigeria, and in a sense, their investment's going to be confiscated. So for a simple example, we had the Okada was the company that came into Lagos and said, we're going to make the Okada industry regulated. We're going to make it safer. People using Okadas are going to know who their driver is. They're going to know who the helmet is. His Excellency Governor Sanwo-Olu came out and was in the opening of it. They invested $5 million, and then later there was a policy that banned Okadas, and all of that investment was lost. There've been many stories around, what's happened with MTN, what's happened with ShopRite. So people have invested and they've been disappointed. So I don't think we need more policies. I think what the government needs to do is show, and it's going to take a little bit of time, that actually, if you come and invest in Nigeria, we're a place that welcomes investment. And of course, every successful economy, whether it's Singapore, whether it's Canada, whether it's the United States, welcomes investment in the appropriate way. And of course, the investment has to follow regulation, and it has to be safe, and it has to serve the people. But what you can't have is a situation where someone invests in the country, and then 6 months later, there's a policy change and their investment is lost. And I think the Honorable Minister for Solid Minerals, while it's applaudable that we're going after the illegal mining, one of the problems in solid minerals is it's very long-term capital. And I can tell you that global players are going to be very cautious about coming to Nigeria because they want to see some track record that their capital will be treated wisely over a long period of time, because it takes 15, 20 years to get a payback on that. Some other industries, like the outsourcing industry I've talked about, fast-moving consumer goods, it's much faster. So I actually think if we give people some confidence in the business environment, we'll see some other industries go first. Solid minerals will come a little bit later.
Now, there's also, let's move away from Forex issue and talk about stay more on trade facilitation. I am worried about what is happening across the continent, considering what AFCFTA set out to achieve. There's been issues in countries like Gabon and Niger and some other African countries, just to mention a few. And to me, I see a pushback for the AFCFTA. So what more do you think? And I think it's beyond the African continent now. How can we facilitate trade across the board? The Minister of Trade, Industry and Investment sure has a lot to deal with. What will be your message, or what would you expect from her moving forward?
Well, I think, I've been a big advocate of AFCFTA for nearly a decade here. But and as I've said before, people need to remember this is a 50-year project of the Africa Union. And any trade agreement, whether it's the EU or NAFTA in North America or in the ASEAN countries, their trade agreement that have been successful, has actually taken decades. So I think people should be happy with the progress and the goodwill. The particular political issues that you notice that, lots of commentators have said, look, we're having coups in Africa, but in fact, most of these coups are happening in Francophone, ex-Francophone colonies. So there may be particular issues there. I think from Nigeria's viewpoint, first, in terms of our exports, yes, we should be supportive of AFCFTA, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The number one thing we should be exporting is services. The number two thing we should be exporting is hydrocarbons. And the number three thing we should be exporting is select agricultural goods where we have an advantage, like cashew nuts or cocoa. And those things are going to go on whether or not AFCFTA moves forward on that. In terms of AFCFTA, my real hope is Nigeria is the largest country in Africa by population, double the next largest country. I think we should be the bigger country, and we should be the ones that are advocates of it. I think people are aware that we were actually late to signing AFCFTA. We didn't get signals in the previous, His Excellency President Buhari's administration, they were that keen on it. There was a fantastic leader of it, Francis, who did a great job, brought states into it. So I think it's going to proceed. But if we want to proceed faster, it really needs leadership from Nigeria. So I really hope this administration is going to step up and do that. But as I said, in terms of the kind of what I would call the short to medium term, AFCFTA is not going to move the needle on our exports, but in the medium to longer term, it will. So they need to do both. They need to focus on those three areas I mentioned for export, not necessarily within Africa. And then they also need to drive AFCFTA. But if we're not behind AFCFTA, then issues like a coup in Gabon can upset it. Smaller countries may not come on board. But if we put ourselves 100% behind it and also show smaller countries they get opportunities. So people were worried about manufacturing move to Ghana. That's absolutely fine. If you have a free trade agreement, different countries are going to do different things. And in fact, Nigeria's comparative advantages in services. So Mr. Elamelu is an example. Access Bank is an example. Are exporting financial services around Africa, exporting music, exporting Nollywood. So we have actually lots of high value exports. We would benefit from it. We don't necessarily have to be the manufacturing hub for the continent, but we do need to be the bigger country that said we will do the right thing for Africa. Africa integration is critical for Africa prosperity. And Nigeria should be at the front of the queue saying, we'll do everything we can to bring along other countries rather than be the laggard. As I said, almost the last to sign the AFCFTA.
A lot of work here, I must tell you. Dr. Nevin, last week, a few weeks ago, there was a report from JP Morgan saying Nigeria's reserves is $3.7 billion and not $33.8 billion. This has generated comments from all concerned bodies. But you're an economist, a professional economist. Can you make us understand what this really means?
Well, I think that for a number of years, the CBN has been run in a way that's quite opaque. I think the country understands that now. There was never a released audit. I think the released audit, I may be incorrect, but stopped in 2017 or 2018. So I think Nigerians have a right to ask the question, what was the CBN doing with the people's money? And of course, for the news to come out that said, in fact, the reserves are not 38 billion, but when you net off the liabilities, it's 4 billion, is really quite shocking. So there should be a forensic audit. I know there's, I'm not quite sure if it's a forensic audit, but I know that there's an inquiry into what's happening to the CBN. And, whatever the situation is, we need to put in place the leadership of the CBN that's going to do the right thing for the country and move forward. But in terms of the absolute numbers, I've said before, Nigeria is a rich country. And one of the things the government said, which is very positive, and I had said for a number of years, is we should be partially floating some state assets. And part of the reason, of course, is to raise money. So, for example, if we did NLNG, it's a very valuable asset. But also because if we've partially floated and it's listed on the stock exchange, gives people access to that capital market to buy parts of Nigeria, but also improves governance. So again, NNPC, like the CBN, has been, not that we would privatize the CBN, but NNPC is again, quite opaque in the way it's running, and the crude for oil, or the crude for oil swaps, for example. So I think that, that what seems like a $30 billion hole, in the context of the size of our economy. It's not that big. If we do the right things, no one is going to remember that the net reserves were only $4 billion. But to replenish them and improve the governance of some of our most valuable assets, I would like to see a partial privatization of some of them. Now, the government's come out and already said they're going to do that. We have MAFI, which is the Ministry of Finance Investments, which basically groups all these investments together. So it includes the refineries, Adjacuza Steel, real estate, and I think NNPC is included in that bucket. But I think that's a way to kind of redress this hole in the reserves on that, and improve the governance, and get more transparency for Nigerians, and improve the value of a lot of these assets. As I said before, we're a rich country. We have lots of assets. Unfortunately, they're not reproducing returns. So, and we promised that the NNPC Group MD has promised that we're going to have one of the refineries up in December. Let's see if that happens. But again, I think one of the things this government's done is good is that if there's non-performance, there's going to be some consequences. So having the GMD of NNPC stand up and say the refinery is coming online in December. If it's not online in December, I hope there's some consequences for that.
Well, interesting stuff. Let's do this in 2 minutes. Dr. Nevin, subsidy is gone. Government is trying to ramp up production to get more money. So it's now revenue issues, and you see palliatives being shared. States are to get 5 billion naira. They've gotten 2 billion naira already, according to the Office of the... So what do you think, moving on, with regards to revenue and sorting out our debt? Let's wrap up on that note.
Well, I think over the years, my position has been pretty clear on this. I mean, people have talked about, a debt problem. I said there's not a debt problem. They talked about a revenue problem. I said there's not a revenue problem. There's a growth problem. We need to grow. And if we're growing at 2 or 3%, we're going to run into problems. And we've had that growth rate for years and years and years. We need to grow a minimum of 6%, 7%. That's the number I put out at PwC. I continue to put that out. I think it's eminently doable. But one thing I do think the government needs to be careful about is this drive to increase revenue before showing they can use resources wisely. So if we go back, for example, I mean, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's over $500 million used on the Abuja CCTV program. I've never seen a CCTV in Abuja. I'm not sure where that money went on that. And, numerous projects. I mentioned the airport in Lagos, the new terminal there, which has not been used, though the Minister of Aviation said it'll go on October 1st for the international airlines. I mean, the money that was so far producing no value in the Kaduna Railway, the steel refinery, the steel production factory, the 3 oil refineries, foil refineries. So there's been so much waste, the cost of NAS, the bulletproof vehicles, the 2 million naira gift to the senators. There's so much waste. So now to come to the people and say, actually, you don't pay enough tax, we're going to raise more tax revenue, I think is fundamentally the wrong thing to do. I think the government needs to show, the federal government needs to show it can use the people's resources wisely. And when it shows it can use the people's resources wisely, then it can talk about raising more revenue, bringing more people into the tax net. But to try to raise more revenue before you demonstrate that you use the money wisely, to me, is simply absurd.
I must thank you so much, Dr. Andrew Nevin. Is a good way to live it. Immediate past Chief Economist, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and economist strategist. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Tony.